At minus 30 degrees, even water turned to glass. Bread froze so hard it had to be cut with bayonets. Canned meat cracked open like stone. Yet somehow, soldiers still ate. This was not comfort food. These were survival foods, strange, improvised, and nearly forgotten. Foods so tough that some were thawed against bare skin. Others gnawed frozen in silence, and a few so calorie-rich they became the only reason men could march another mile through snow. None of it was in the ration book civilians saw. These were the foods soldiers carried into frozen battlefield meals designed to outlast fire, fuel, and sometimes even taste itself. Most people today have never even heard of them. But, in the war, they were lifelines that kept entire divisions alive when the cold killed faster than bullets. Stay with this till the end, because these 8 frozen survival foods might be the hardest, strangest meals ever eaten in human history. And if the world turns cold again, they may be the only ones that still work. Subscribe now, because forgotten resilience is the only resilience that lasts. Number 1. Frozen black bread. In the frozen fronts of World War II, bread was no longer bread. Black loaves, heavy with rye and filler grains, turned to stone the moment the temperature dropped below zero. At minus 30 degrees, they were so solid that knives bent and teeth cracked trying to bite them. Soldiers joked bitterly that their rations could be used as weapons, but no one laughed when hunger gnawed deeper than the frost. The solution was crude, but it kept men alive. Bayonets became bread knives. Soldiers stabbed into the rock-hard loaves, prying off shards like chipping ice. Some placed pieces inside their coats, pressed against bare skin, waiting for body heat to thaw them just enough to chew. Others held fragments near a hidden ember, risking discovery just to soften a single bite. Black bread carried more than calories. It was dense with rye, sawdust fillers, and whatever scraps of flour the supply chain could still provide. Civilians had long complained about its taste, bitter, coarse, unkind to the stomach. But to soldiers in the cold, it was the difference between marching and collapsing. Every frozen shard was fuel, even if it felt more like chewing wood than food. Yet, desperation pushed even further. When loaves cracked apart, crumbs were saved and boiled into thin gruel. Frozen ends were shaved into soups, thickening water into something that resembled a meal. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could be wasted. In conditions where rifles froze solid, the idea of throwing away a piece of bread was unthinkable. But this survival carried limits. Frost robbed bread of texture, of flavor, even of what little softness it once had. Stomachs turned from the strain, jaws ached, and still men ate because not eating meant surrender to the cold. Black bread was no comfort, no luxury. It was a daily reminder that war had stripped food down to its barest form: calories, survival, endurance. For soldiers, each frozen slice was more than a meal. It was proof that they could endure another march, another night, another morning in the endless snow. And in the silence of the trenches, that mattered more than taste. Would you force yourself to gnaw stone-hard bread, knowing it was the only thing standing between you and collapse? Number 2. Salted pork and lard blocks. In the killing cold of World War II, fat was more than food. It was fire for the body. Soldiers learned quickly that bread alone froze the stomach, leaving them weak and shivering. What kept them standing was salted pork and solid blocks of lard rations despised in peace, worshipped in war. The pork was packed heavy with salt, so dense it could last for months without spoiling. In winter, it stiffened into slabs that clanged like metal against mess tins. Soldiers carved it with bayonets, shaving off strips that glistened with fat, then swallowed them cold. There was no luxury of frying, no warm pan to soften it. The fat was eaten raw, slipping down throats that had long forgotten taste, but never forgotten hunger. Then came the lard blocks of pure fat, issued in waxed paper. Civilians might have turned from it in disgust, but to men in 30 degrees, it was gold. A single bite delivered more calories than an entire loaf of frozen bread. Soldiers learned to cut cubes of lard and tuck them into bread crusts, swallowing the mixture for slow-burning fuel. It was survival by chemistry. Fat ignited inside the body, keeping them marching when their legs begged to stop. Yet there were twists to this crude salvation. In some units, men rubbed lard on their rifles to keep bolts from freezing, trading food for function. Others smeared it on boots as a desperate waterproofing against snow. Every gram had value beyond the stomach. But the cost was harsh. Salt burned cracked lips and parched throats. Too much lard turned stomachs sour, sending men stumbling with cramps. Still, the alternative was worse. In the endless white, soldiers accepted the nausea, because weakness meant falling behind, and falling behind meant never returning. Even in the darkest days, pork and lard carried symbolism. Soldiers saw it as stored warmth, as a ration that refused to fail them even when fires went out. Each greasy bite, however miserable, meant one more hour of life wrestled back from the cold. Would you eat raw slabs of fat, knowing they were the only thing keeping your body burning through the night? Number 3, frozen potatoes. For soldiers in World War II, the potato was more than a crop. It was survival buried under snow. Fields once filled with golden harvests froze into icy graves. But men refused to surrender their most dependable food. Even when temperatures dropped to -30 degrees, potatoes became a lifeline, dug from the frozen ground like treasure. The tubers were stored in pits, covered with straw and earth. Families and soldiers alike returned to these caches through winter, scraping frost away to uncover what little remained edible. But the cold changed them. Flesh hardened, starch turned sweet, and sometimes the potatoes froze solid, impossible to cut without an axe. Still, men carried them back in sacks, knowing they held more than just calories. They held continuity. In the trenches, frozen potatoes had two fates. When fire could be risked, they were roasted quickly over embers, skin blistering black, while the inside softened just enough to chew. The smoke carried risk, but also the smell of home, a reminder of meals eaten in peace. When fire was impossible, potatoes were gnawed raw, icy and brittle, filling bellies with starch even as jaws ached from the cold. There were hidden tricks, too. Soldiers learned to thaw potatoes by tucking them inside coats, close to the body. Hours later, the stiff lumps softened slightly, enough to be sliced into thin strips. Some even grated them frozen, mixing shreds, flour, or crumbs to stretch rations further. Every method carried ingenuity, born from desperation. But this survival was not without cost. Raw potatoes sometimes upset empty stomachs. Frozen flesh lacked flavor, turning meals into endurance. Number 4, hardtack biscuits. Among the most despised yet indispensable rations of World War II were hardtack biscuits. Soldiers called them teeth breakers for a reason. Made from little more than flour and water, baked until every drop of moisture was gone, they were designed not for taste, but for permanence. In 30 degrees cold, they became even harder. Slabs that could last for years, but punished anyone desperate enough to bite them. In frozen trenches, hardtack served as both food and endurance test. Soldiers carried them in cloth sacks, each biscuit weighing no more than a stone, but feeling heavier with every attempt to chew. Jaws ached, teeth cracked, and still the dry crumbs were forced down, chased with melted snow or bitter coffee substitute. It wasn't a meal, it was survival disguised as punishment. But ingenuity turned misery into sustenance. Soldiers soaked the biscuits in whatever liquid they could spare: melted snow, thin soup, even grease from salted pork. Soaking softened them enough to break apart, transforming stone-hard slabs into something closer to porridge. Some crumbled them into tins with water, heating the mixture over hidden embers to make a dense paste soldiers jokingly called trench pudding. Others discovered a curious twist. If smashed into powder with rifle butts, the crumbs could be mixed with lard or condensed milk, creating compact, high-calorie lumps that fueled long marches. What began as a hated ration became, through improvisation, a portable survival bar. Yet the limits were obvious. The biscuits were tasteless, dry, and carried little nutrition beyond raw carbohydrates. Eating too many caused stomach cramps. Eating too few meant collapsing from hunger. Soldiers often cursed them, but never refused them. Because when bread froze solid, potatoes ran out, and meat was gone, the hardtack was still there, waiting, unyielding, ready to outlast both soldier and war. Civilians rarely saw them. These were rations made for fronts where supply chains collapsed, not kitchens back home. To the men in the snow, hardtack wasn't a choice. It was proof that survival didn't ask for comfort, only persistence. For soldiers staring across endless white, chewing a softened biscuit by candlelight was a reminder that even the hardest food could keep a man alive another day. Would you choke down rock-hard biscuits, knowing they might be the last thing between you and starvation? Number 5. Frozen fish strips. When rivers and lakes froze over in winter campaigns, soldiers still turned to them for food. Ice was no barrier, it was another enemy to break. With bayonets, axes, or even rifle butts, holes were cut through the frozen surface, and whatever fish could be pulled out became instant survival currency. But there was no time, no fire, and no luxury of cooking. The fish were sliced thin, frozen solid, and eaten as they were. Strips of icy flesh chewed into the night. This practice wasn't about taste, it was about speed. Thin strips froze so quickly they could be carried without rotting, turning fish into a kind of battlefield jerky. Soldiers sucked on them slowly, thawing with breath, swallowing cold mouthfuls of protein that gave just enough energy to keep moving. In conditions where canned rations had run out and bread had turned brittle, frozen fish kept hunger at bay. The brutal reality was clear. Flesh so cold it numbed teeth, strips so stiff they snapped like wood between the fingers. Yet in that misery lay ingenuity. Men discovered that slicing the fish paper thin made it easier to chew. Others stored strips inside coats, letting body heat soften them before eating. A strange, almost ritual habit formed. The act of carrying food against the skin to keep it alive long enough to eat. Twists emerged from necessity. In some units, salt was rubbed onto the fish before freezing, creating a crude preservation that added both flavor and longevity. Others dried them further near hidden embers, turning fragile strips into something closer to traditional jerky. Every variation was born from scarcity, from the refusal to go hungry even when nature itself seemed determined to starve them. But risks remained. Raw fish carried sickness. Poorly prepared strips sometimes spoiled, especially when temperatures rose unexpectedly. Soldiers who gambled on bad meat sometimes paid with days of weakness. Yet even with dangers, the practice endured, because hunger was the harsher threat. Frozen fish strips weren't delicacies. They were proof of resourcefulness, proof that soldiers could carve life out of rivers locked in ice. In a war where supplies vanished overnight, they turned the frozen landscape itself into a battlefield ally. Would you chew raw strips of frozen fish just to silence hunger in a world of endless snow? Number 6. Condensed milk blocks. Among the rarest and most cherished rations of World War II was condensed milk. Thick, sweet, and calorie-rich, it was meant to be poured into tea or stirred into porridge. But in the frozen fronts, it rarely flowed. At minus 30 degrees, tins solidified into bricks of sugar and fat so dense they could be carved like stone. For soldiers, this wasn't a disappointment. It was an opportunity. A single block of condensed milk carried more energy than bread, more comfort than any salted meat. Men prized it not just as food, but as a reminder of sweetness in a world stripped bare of luxury. In foxholes, soldiers chipped at the frozen mass with knives, shaving off slivers to suck slowly. Each shard melted on the tongue like frost-turned honey, a momentary escape from the bitterness of rations. But condensed milk was more than morale. It was fuel. Sugar provided immediate strength, while fat burned slow, keeping the body alive in the endless cold. Soldiers discovered they could carry the solid blocks for days without spoilage. A piece before a march became insurance against collapse, a reserve of warmth hidden in a pocket. There were unexpected twists, too. Some mixed shavings into coffee substitutes, turning bitter black liquid into something almost palatable. Others smeared softened pieces on biscuits or bread crusts, transforming stone-hard staples into meals worth swallowing. In desperate moments, soldiers even used it as barter, trading a tin for tobacco, gloves, or extra socks. Few rations held such power, both physical and psychological. Yet limits were real. Too much sugar turned empty stomachs sour. The tins themselves were heavy, sometimes more burden than blessing, and opening them without proper tools often meant using bayonets, risking injury for the sake of food. Still, no one wasted a drop. Even the crusted edges of tins were scraped clean, every gram consumed. For many, condensed milk carried symbolism far beyond survival. It was a taste of sweetness in a world ruled by salt and frost. It reminded men of kitchens back home, of families pouring milk into morning tea. In the bleakest conditions, that memory itself became nourishment. Would you guard a single tin of condensed milk like treasure, knowing it might carry you through nights when everything else failed? Subscribe now. More hidden wartime foods are still waiting to be revealed. Number 7. Dried beans and peas. In the brutal winters of World War II, some foods outlasted both cold and time itself. Among the most dependable were dried beans and peas, rations so simple yet so enduring that they became the backbone of countless winter meals. To civilians, they were ordinary pantry staples. To soldiers in 30-degree cold, they were survival disguised as little stones. Packed in cloth sacks, beans and peas froze as hard as pebbles. Soldiers joked they could be fired from rifles, but in truth, each sack was as valuable as ammunition. Protein, starch, and a slow burn of calories hid inside those dry shells, waiting to be released with heat and water. The problem was fire. Where flames were forbidden, sacks of beans sat untouched, heavy burdens carried through snow. But when the chance came, soldiers seized it. Boiled in dented tins or battered helmets, beans swelled into thick, steaming soups. Peas dissolved into mushy stews, filling trenches with the first real warmth in weeks. A single pot could feed an entire squad, each man clutching his mess tin as if it held gold. Salted pork grease, potato shavings, or even crumbs of bread were stirred in, transforming the humble legumes into feasts compared to frozen rations. Twists came from ingenuity. Some soldiers pre-soaked beans inside their coats, carrying them in jars filled with melted snow. Hours later, they cooked faster, saving precious fuel. Others roasted peas dry on metal sheets, chewing them as crunchy snacks that lasted on long marches. In desperate times, men ground beans into powder, mixing with water to form a dense paste that could be eaten raw. But there were limits. Beans took hours to soften fully, and fuel was scarce. Half-cooked meals often led to stomach cramps, yet hunger was stronger than pain. The dry weight of sacks slowed movement, forcing soldiers to choose between food security and speed. Still, the cost was always worth it. Unlike bread, beans are never molded. Unlike meat, they are never spoiled. They simply endured, silent and dependable, waiting for the right moment to bring strength back to tired bodies. For many soldiers, the sight of beans bubbling in a battered pot was not just food, it was proof of possibility. A reminder that even in frozen wastelands, patience and resourcefulness could create warmth from the simplest things. Would you carry heavy sacks of beans through endless snow, trusting that one day they'd be the meal that kept you alive? Subscribe now. More forgotten wartime foods are still waiting to be revealed. Number 8. Frozen cabbage and root vegetables. When rations collapsed and supplies stopped coming, the only foods that could be trusted were the ones pulled directly from the earth. Cabbage, carrots, turnips, and beets, humble crops civilians planted in gardens, and soldiers dug from commandeered fields, became lifelines when nothing else endured the cold. But in 30 degrees, even these survivors turned to stone. Root vegetables were buried in storage pits lined with straw, mud, or ash. Families dug them out weeks later, hacking at the frozen ground with shovels or bare hands. Soldiers on the front lines raided abandoned farm plots, pulling half-frozen turnips from icy soil and stuffing them into packs. They were heavy, awkward to carry, but they didn't rot. In a world where bread molded and meat spoiled, frozen roots simply waited beneath the earth. Cabbage carried its own strange magic. Heads stored in cellars froze solid, yet layers inside remained edible once peeled. Soldiers peeled off icy leaves, crunching them raw like brittle paper. Others boiled shredded cabbage into thin soups, filling pots with steam that carried the smell of survival across trenches. Even when flavor vanished, bulk mattered, and cabbage delivered weight in a way no biscuit could. Twists emerged with every adaptation. Beets were grated frozen, mixed into bread dough for color and sweetness. Carrots were thawed against skin during marches, then chewed raw for a burst of sugar. Turnips were roasted quickly over hidden embers, skin charred black, flesh soft and steaming. Every vegetable became a puzzle, each solved with improvisation. But limits pressed hard. Frozen flesh lost texture. Meals turned watery, thin, sometimes bitter. Stomachs suffered, teeth ached, and the monotony crushed morale. Yet even then, these vegetables offered something no other ration could: volume. They filled the belly, silencing hunger long enough for soldiers to keep moving. For many, the image of steam rising from a pot of cabbage soup in the dead of winter was unforgettable. It was not comfort, it was not feast. It was proof that even when firewood ran low, when supplies were gone, when every march felt like the last, the earth still yielded food that refused to vanish. Would you kneel in frozen mud to dig out roots, trusting that what you pulled from the earth might be the single thing between you and collapse? Subscribe now, because the last secrets of wartime survival are still waiting to be revealed. World War II carved hunger into every face it touched. Soldiers in trenches chewed food frozen harder than stone. Families at home turned scraps, ash, and roots into meals that barely held them together. These weren't recipes. They were survival systems, brutal, improvised, and unforgettable. What they left behind is more than history. It is a warning. Comfort is fragile. Supply chains are fragile. The idea that food will always be waiting on shelves is fragile. But the skills they used: the frozen bread chipped with bayonets, the lard swallowed raw, the vegetables dug from frozen earth, those skills outlast every system. The truth is simple. Survival was never about abundance. It was about adaptation. They endured because they refused to accept nothing as nothing. Even frozen soil, even bitter scraps, even food that broke their teeth was turned into fuel for one more day. If you've stayed with this story until now, you've proven something already. You understand that knowledge is power, and forgotten knowledge is priceless. Don't let it vanish again. Subscribe now and take back the resilience that kept soldiers alive in frozen trenches, because the next crisis will not wait. And when it comes, strength alone won't save you. Only preparation will.